Across the nation, the progressive movement has increasingly turned its attention to seeking gains at a local level. In 2017, Jackson shot to the top of the list of cities with progressive leadership, with the election of Chokwe Antar Lumumba, who's been called America's most radical mayor. We recently sat down with Kali Akuno to learn more. He recently was a headliner at the Fearless Cities 2018 North American Conference. He's the founder of Cooperation Jackson and author of Jackson Rising, The Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi. We started off by discussing the challenges of building an independent progressive movement.
You have to have a counterbalance, to the very institution of the state itself, and the conditioning that the institution brings upon people. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I'm saying that very, as deep as I can to try to get people to understand it if you haven't worked on that side of the equation. And I had the, experience, which I, forever be grateful for, working in the administration of Chokwe Lumumba.
The late
Chokwe Lumumba. And, working on the inside, trying to figure out, how do we implement our program, and then trying to figure out how do you overcome the internal barriers that you don't necessarily see. And there's not many, left books that describe to you, how do you fight against the bureaucracy? How do you fight against the rules? How do you fight against, the limitations of the zoning? And you think you can just come with good policy and institute good policy, and then things automatically will move your way, when there are so many institutional barriers, both inside and outside the very act of governance, that, on that level through that institution, that I think you really have to master. So having candidates and people in office who go through a very systematic training, I think I would say from my experience over the last 8 years, has really highlighted that to me in a particular way, that, our movement and the social movement, I think, is a good school to generate a certain level of skill, but there's a deeper level of skill if you're actually going to get in that administrative stuff to the act of governance that I think the left still doesn't fully grapple with. I think our theory is not fully equipped to deal with now, particularly how the state has been changed, in the neoliberal era, that I think we have to build new institutions, new capacities, political parties, to do a different type of orientation and training than I think we've done before. And to me, it speaks to a deeper level of political transformation in this country that we have to have. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that, in this country, for the most part, we vote on individuals, right? And so the very nature of the electoral platform elevates individuals than it even does more so really than parties. The parties are just kind of like a broad menu that people can choose from or abandon whenever they're in office. And there's no real mechanisms to hold those individuals accountable, during the period after you elect them, be it a 2-year period or a 4-year period. The only real accountability measure within the actual structure is just unelect them 2 or 4 years later. But how to actually hold them true to following a decision that he or she allegedly ran on, it's very difficult, just given the nature of the system itself. And I think building the kind of vehicles that I've been trying to describe of late, of these new kind of electoral party formations, that if progressives are going to and radicals and revolutionaries are going to get into this endeavor, we have to build these institutions and not just leave it to the good graces of an individual, because they're going to run into a mountain of organization as soon as they get in there, which is all about no and all about, that's a great idea, but if it doesn't fit this financial regulation, this financial code, it can't go any further. I think there are ways around that, but you got to have a social pressure and a social movement and a detailed knowledge and understanding of the rules and regulations within that aspect, I think, for us to be able to tackle this and go deeper with where we say we want to go.
There's popular assemblies in Jackson. Mm-hmm. How sounds great on paper, but how is that? Talk about how that's actually coming together.
I want people to not over-romanticize certain things about Jackson. Jackson has its fair share of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the people's assemblies, I think right now folks should know that in Jackson there are several groups who are doing something akin to an assembly, or they're calling it that. And I think, while many people are challenged by this kind of popularization of the notion of people's assemblies in Jackson, I think it's actually a positive thing. That doesn't mean I agree with everything that all of the folks who now call themselves having assemblies are doing. But what I do think it speaks to is a cultural shift, and that we're moving forces more to the left and getting them to have to accept including people in a participatory way, or at least giving lip service to it, in how they're making their decisions, in how they're trying to implement whatever level of governance they exercise within their organization or within the social movement. But now you have many different models of what that looks like in Jackson. So you can't say that there's one model, to answer your question, you can't say that there's one model that now exists. I think there are contending models that are there, and I think that's a good thing. I think there's a way in which some of the differences can be very generative, in the sense of producing new dynamic practices, raising questions that in other space may not be able to be raised, may not be able to engage, but in a different space, under a different leadership, a different confluence of forces, new questions emerge, new issues emerge, new ways of approaching people emerge. But the traditional model, that we have been employing, traditional in kind of the Jackson sense, most of our assemblies were called around particular issues. And they always have kind of like really three components. The first component would be an education component, to make sure everybody in the community was aware, like, hey, if there's something going down about the water, there's new commission, or there's a new threat to privatize it, or whatever the situation may be. So to hear the different voices in the community that have some level of in-depth knowledge or experience directly about this issue, bring them to the forefront, have them speak on it, raise the different issues, raise the different questions. Then there'll be a general open discussion about, this is what we think, asking for more information and more clarity. Then there's the third phase, which is what are we going to do about it? The action phase. And folks having an open discussion about that, and then figuring out how do we self-organize our ways in terms of committees, a program, set of demands, timeline, or implementation platform that the assembly and the folks who were in the assembly were then going to execute. That was the basic kind of format, and I think it remains the format, at least the ones that Cooperation Jackson is involved with the Jackson Human Rights Institute, trying to maintain, that type of format, but also the ones that the Malcolm X grassroots movement and the Mumba administration are also administering. I think those two are still kind of remaining within that trajectory and trying to elicit the broadest level of support for different issues, some of which overlap, some of which are separate and distinct at this point. But that's the general format. And I think in both cases, the overall goal still is, to build like a dual power, so that the way that we can, the community itself can check the repressive apparatus of the state, but also institute its own programs for how to manage its own affairs, how to govern its own affairs at the level of the community absent of the state. Those are the two aspects of building this dual power that I think both narratives, both efforts are still trying to project and maintain.
Stay tuned to part 2 of this interview. For The Real News, this is Jess Lenore.